Last fall, our friend Josh casually mentioned that we needed to have coffee with his dad. That coffee date led to another with the senior pastor of his church, Dr. Ken Van Vliet. When my husband Mike and I sat down at that little bistro table, all we knew was that according to our friends, our spiritual journeys were very similar. Never would I have imagined to what extent or how deeply encouraged we would leave that day. In this podcast episode, you'll hear Ken's story take us through spiritual crisis, an invitation from God to come away and die, a reckoning with the truth, and the choice to reorient his life around God's love. I believe God is offering this same invitation to other pastors and leaders to go from the platform to the table. As Ken shares with us, it is a costly journey, but the beauty of his story is it's not just his story. It's the story of his entire church. It offers us a way forward as leaders towards normalizing deconstruction and making space for difficult questions and emotions to exist. Ken and I talk about how this journey really is like coming off of a drug, arresting a compulsion to perform and learning how to receive God's love. So, in the words of the big book, may we all say, let it begin with me. I'm Sarah Carrera DeFucia, and this is Platform to Table, where stories of spiritual reformation are shared to encourage others on a journey of discovery of God's unconditional love. Dr. Ken Van Vliet's life is dedicated to helping others discover God's deep and abiding love. He has served as the senior pastor at Monte Vista Chapel for the last 23 years. He is also lead mentor of the Doctor of Ministry and Leadership and Spiritual Formation program at Portland Seminary. Ken holds a D.Min in Leadership and Spiritual Formation, a Master's of Divinity, and a B.A. in Business Administration. His expertise and research interests include spiritual formation in the local church, organizational and cultural change, leadership development, and pastoral coaching. Ken enjoys riding his motorcycle, the outdoors, and savoring a good glass of wine. He shares this beautiful life with his wife, Michelle, and his two grown children in Turlock, California, where he was when we spoke. All right, we are recording. Welcome, Ken Van Vliet. Wonderful to have you on the Platform to Table podcast. And wonderful to have you on the podcast, and how cool it is that just a couple months ago, we had the opportunity to be sitting across from each other at a little bistro table in a cafe. And now here we are sitting kind of across from each other on a podcast. It is really cool. It was so cool that day to hear when I got to meet you through our mutual friend. So cool to see how much we had in common and how your core values and your story, the ministry that you do in your church and at the university, how that just so mirrors and reflects the passion of what Platform to Table hopes to be and become. And you are so far ahead of us on this journey. And I couldn't have thought of a better person to come on the podcast for that reason, to really name some of the things that are close to our heart and then just kind of embody that in your story for us. I know that so many listeners today are just going to love to hear everything that you have to share. So thank you for being here.
Yeah, no, it's a privilege. And likewise, it was just a highlight of my sabbatical, actually, to sit down with you and Mike and listen to your hearts. It was a grace. So thank you so much. I look forward to our time.
Yeah. And I look forward to meeting your wife this weekend. Yeah, we're going to get to spend some little time together outside of the podcast. And so I'll get to meet her and your daughter too, right?
Yes. Yep.
Yes. Okay. How many kids do you have?
So I have two. I have a son, Benjamin, who's married, and he's over in Durham, teaches math. And I have a daughter who works in graphic design in the wine industry.
Oh, awesome. In the wine industry.
Yes.
Okay, really cool. So us all meeting together at the winery for a wine tasting is very in her realm and ballpark. Okay.
Yeah, this is a work trip for her.
Yes. Okay, good. Well, she can show us how it's done.
Yep.
As part of her work.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, as you're sharing your story with us today, before we kind of like jump in, I just wanted to say that a really cool thing that I noticed on your website for your church, Monte Vista Chapel, was that you guys offer story groups as part of your formational pathway or discipleship
Yeah,
pathway for your people in your church. And one of the things that is said in the description for the story groups is through the sharing of our stories, we learn to be attentive to the Holy Spirit as we listen to what he may be doing in our lives and the lives of others.
yeah,
And that's certainly what I hope to do as I'm hearing your story today. And I invite all the listeners to do with us as
yeah,
well as we're listening to your story. We're listening with the ears, we're looking with the eyes through the lens of the Holy Spirit to see how he may be speaking to us about our own story. But as we're listening, what do you hope we are hearing as like central themes or core values that the Lord has written in and through your story?
yeah.
Or even if you want to think of it in terms of legacy, someday when somebody else tells your story and shares your story about Ken and the impact that you've had on their lives, what do you hope that they have heard?
Yeah, I think the first thing that comes to mind is this kind of faithful presence.
Mm.
That's what God has been to me, and in this whole story, it's really a story about what God has been surfacing. I think this is interesting. This is actually the first time I've ever done a podcast or told my story, and part of it is a hesitancy around it being about me and my story, because it really is a story of God's faithfulness, and then my response and our community's response to God's faithfulness in that. So I just go back to kind of this steady faithfulness, this faithful presence, both of God and then not only of myself, but our community in response to God's faithfulness. So it's this long, I have a Benedictine strain in me of like a commitment to a place for a long period of time, because I think that's where God does some of the deepest work. So, yeah.
Oh, and it is so beautiful. That is one of the things that stood out to me when you were telling me just a little bit about your story at that coffee shop that one day. The way that God has been faithful to you, but not just to you, you've brought your church along with you
Yeah.
as you've been journeying through some of the things that you're going to share with us. So I
Yeah.
definitely heard that. And I know that that's going to come through today as you're sharing your story.
Yeah.
Okay, so where would you like to begin? Certainly, I think you should tell us a little bit about your background. Maybe I know that on this journey, your God image has been radically transformed, how
Yeah.
that has impacted your sense of identity and self, how you view others. Well, that initially, where was that initially formed for you? Tell us a little bit about your spiritual upbringing, your childhood,
Yeah.
things like that.
Yeah, so I was born and raised in the Central Valley of California, which is one of the most productive agricultural areas in the world. And the reason I say that is because what comes along with that is this like a certain type of a person. They're hard workers. They're
Mm,
pull themselves up by their bootstraps. And so that's part of the air that I breathed as I grew up. And then you add to that, my father is actually an immigrant from the Netherlands. And so he came over from Holland as a young boy right after World War II. His father was a part of the Dutch underground, and so he had a pretty rough upbringing in the war in that reality. So when he moved over here, the family started over really with nothing. And so as a young boy, he was helping his father build a family business. So they were hard workers. They were sort of survivors, and they succeeded. I mean, they built a fairly large family business that had um, uh, it was dairy and farming, agriculture, and the whole business. So I was raised with this really strong work ethic, high levels of responsibility. We worked hard and we played hard, and so yeah, that was part of it, and that shaped my image of God. At the same time, I also inherited my faith from my family. They had
mm,
a strong faith. I was raised in the Dutch Reformed Church, or the Christian Reformed Church, and we went to church every Sunday, twice on Sundays, once on Wednesday night. And church was really the central hub for our family and for our community. Everybody did this. I went to school and church and lived with the same group of people. So it was really a tight knit faith. At the same time, the Christian Reformed Church was fairly stoic.
Hmm.
That was just part of its makeup. It was a real faith. It was genuine, but few people talked about it in any personal sense. But I think for me, it was different. As a young boy, I had some experiences with God. Um, I
Really?
remember the one of the first ones. It was on a Good Friday service, and it was an evening service, and we were standing in the back, and it was done. The service was about done, and we were singing the last verse from it was When I Surveyed the Wondrous Cross. And I can remember as I was singing those words, were the whole realm of nature mine, that were an offering far too small. Love so amazing, so divine, demands my life, my soul, my all. And I just remember like Jesus somehow through the Spirit just kind of saying to me, Ken, if this was just you, if you were the only person, I love you enough to do that. I would give
Hmm.
my life for you. And so I had this mixed view of God. Like I had on
Hmm.
one hand this real clear reality that he deeply loved me, and on the other hand, I had a sense that God was a bit stoic and demanding, emotionally removed, sort of a pull yourself up by your bootstraps sort of God, much like my dad, much like most of the men that I knew growing up. Um, yeah, and so that was kind of my understanding of God.
Yeah. Wow. That's really good that you were able to draw the comparison between what the immigrant plight to your God image and how
Yeah.
that shaped that.
Hmm.
I can certainly relate. My family was Italian. They were Italian
Hmm.
immigrants. They came over out of poverty, severe poverty and starvation in Sicily. So
Yeah.
they had to pull up
Yeah.
by their bootstraps and work
Yep.
really hard to make ends meet. So it definitely does play a part. And then
Yeah.
here we are in America, in a country that is all about the American dream and making
Yeah.
that dream happen. So it all
Yeah.
kind of like feeds in together for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. And so it affected how I ended up thinking about going into ministry too, because that being a having those experiences of God, I was drawn to the church as I think a young boy into ministry. But in that Dutch culture, being a pastor was not really thought of very highly because you lived off of the graces of other people. You were perceived as not being a hard worker. And so
Ah,
I was really cautious about like I had this internal draw, but externally I was like, yeah, that's not going to be well received in my community. And so I kind of had that all growing up until I met my future wife, Michelle. At the time, we were in college when I first met her, and she had a very demonstrative faith.
hmm,
Like she'd come to Christ later on in her life, and she talked about it in a very personal way. It was a way
hmm,
that probably for the first time I was drawn to this, uh, yeah, to the more relational side of faith because I hadn't had that much growing up, and she was really ministry minded.
hmm,
She had a draw towards that as well. In retrospect, you'd have to talk to her about this, but I think she actually probably wanted to be a pastor.
hmm.
Um, but in that culture, in that time frame, there was no way for a woman to enter into a
Yeah.
pastoral role. And so I think she took kind of, well, the next best thing would be to marry a pastor and be in ministry that way. And I remember having this conversation with her and saying, well, like Michelle, if that's what you're dead set on, like you're dating the wrong guy because I am not going to be a pastor.
Really?
It's just not going to happen. Um, she married me anyway. Uh, um, and in the end, obviously, she was right. I mean, we went to work in the family business. But what was interesting is, I didn't have a real close relationship with my dad outside of work.
Hmm.
I mean, he was a good man and all that, but
Hmm.
again, pretty stoic.
Hmm.
And we were driving to one of our ranches out in the Delta, and he was on the two-way radio. He was always busy working, and all the trucks had two-way radios so that he could dispatch and run the business as he was driving. And I was going with him, and all of a sudden he stopped in the midst of a conversation, hung his microphone up, looked at me across the pickup, and said, "Ken, I like there's plenty of room for you in the family business. You're a good worker. You know, there's space for you here." He said, "But I don't think you'll ever be happy until you go work at the church." And it just shocked me, like, because I had never experienced my dad tend in that sort of way. I didn't even think
Right.
he was aware of that. And something about that, though, really released me um, to this process of going into ministry. And so that's where Michelle and I were married now, and that's when I started to turn direction towards ministry. That's kind of the
Wow.
story. Yeah.
Wow. So you had that experience as a child with that hymn, which was kind of like this real personal experience with God. And
Yeah.
then just over the years between then until the time that you met Michelle, it was just like a simmering or in the background, maybe that there might be more interest or more things to explore. And it wasn't until your dad actually said that to you that you felt kind of released to fully
Yeah.
explore what that desire might look like practically.
Yeah, because I mean, I was kind of a church rat, if you would. I mean,
Yeah.
I loved Sunday school. I loved the
Okay.
stories. I mean, as a teenager, I met at 6 o'clock in the morning with my pastor, and he was
Oh,
discipling me personally. You know,
yeah.
I just had a draw in that direction, but I didn't have a sense of release that that was going to be accepted. And I think you'll hear in my story this desire for acceptance. And I didn't think that
Mm,
that being a pastor would be accepted. So that release from my dad and having a partner in my wife, I think were the
yeah.
things that drew me to be able to move towards ministry.
You might be going to you might be going to touch on this as we move forward here, but what denomination was Michelle raised in? Like when she came into your life, into your relationship, what was she?
Yeah, so she didn't grow up in a church. Her family were
Okay.
believers, but
Mm,
they had moved away from the Central Valley. She'd grown up in the Bay Area,
mm-hmm.
and so when they came back, they started to go. She started to go to church,
Hmm.
and then her father started to come, and then the rest of the family kind of joined. But it was a
Okay.
non-denominational. I think it was an evangelical free church, but a typical
Yeah.
evangelical conservative church.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So the two of you are together. You're ready to start exploring ministry. Where are we
Yeah.
going next?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think it was in 1996, and I know that because that's when my son was born. Within a few months' time frame, Michelle and I we had our first child,
Hmm.
and I quit the business and kind of wrote that all off and um, was hired as a young adults and young marrieds pastor at Monte Vista Chapel, which is the church that we were attending. And it was a church that we were volunteering at. Michelle and I had been working on we'd been volunteering as college leaders, and that ministry had really grown. And so they had hired me for that position. And it was really wild. Those first 5 years, it kind of felt like the TV show Survivor in some ways because
Yeah.
like every person that hired me quit, and then I ended up taking that position. So I went from a young adults family to a family
Yeah.
ministries. Then the adults pastor quit, so I went to that position, and then the senior pastor was looking for an executive pastor, and so they decided to put me in that position. And
Mm.
then 5 years later, he had decided it was time for him to retire, and they started a search process of which I was a part of. So I was kind of an interim. I was preaching for that year and running staff and so forth. And at the end of that year, they decided to go with the problems they knew rather than go out and find different problems that they didn't know. And they offered me the job as senior pastor. And you know, in some ways, I think I was like just the right person that they were looking for to grow the church, because I loved God best as I understood at the time. And I was a hard worker. I was familiar with the agricultural, that agrarian kind of mindset. And they saw me as somebody who was a hard worker, and that was a value to them. I also had some business background. That was
Hmm.
my undergrad degree, was in business administration and finance. And you got to remember, this was a time when it was kind of pastor as CEO. That was
Yeah.
the kind of person. So I think they were looking for that because they thought I'd be the kind of person who'd grow the church. And for the most part, like, that's what happened. I mean,
Wow.
I was part of three in those first years. I was part of three capital campaigns. We raised over $5 million to build a new
Oh
student
my
ministry center
gosh.
because all the kids who were coming. We built a
Yeah.
children's ministry center because of all the new families who were coming. And then we remodeled the worship center so that it had all the latest technology with the, iMag and theater seats and lights and all the bells and whistles and all that stuff. And by 2008, the church had grown larger than it had ever been. There were about 1,200 on weekends. I remember we had crested the mid 2000s on a Easter Sunday, and
Wow.
it just seemed like everything was up and to the right. The church
Yeah.
the church was growing, and like so much so that I was looking for a leadership coach
Hmm.
because
Just to
there's a
help you manage all of it.
yeah, because back at that time, there's this idea that once the church hits 12 or 1300, you have to change your leadership style in order to be able to continue
Hmm.
to grow the church. And that was my mode. Like, we're going to keep growing this thing. So I started to look for a leadership coach, and I went through a few of them who I
Hmm.
just like, I didn't find
Hmm.
anything that they really had to offer. And so, which is a bit arrogant on my part. I see that in retrospect. Um, but I ended up being introduced to Cheryl Fleischer, and she was a woman who had worked at two of the largest churches in the United States. They were prominent, and she had worked in some significant roles there. So I thought, there it is. She's the one who's going to be able to help me continue to grow the church. Well, it didn't take me long to realize that as we started to meet, she was much more concerned about what was going on inside of me
Oh,
than
wow.
than she
Good
was
for
con-
her.
yeah, than what she was concerned about, growing the church. And so she would ask questions, and we'd have these conversations. She would come up from San Diego once a month, once every other month, and we'd spend time together. And um, like, the questions she asked were both disturbing and drawing at the same time. She was worried about, not worried, but she was curious and concerned about my inner life and what was driving me and why I was doing what I was doing. She was much less concerned about how you get something done than what was underneath the surface.
I
And I
I'd
could
like
feel things starting to unravel.
Oh, yeah. That was my next question is what's first of all, how old were you at the time?
So I was probably 42, 3, something like that, 40s,
Okay,
early
so
40s.
early 40s and you've been going up and to the right for several years.
Yep.
What is going on in your mind at that time? As she's
Yeah.
asking you these questions, did you have a sense or were you able to really name that and really see what was beneath the surface?
Yeah,
Or
not in
was
not yeah, not in the moment. I couldn't see it in the moment. What I was experiencing was a sense of kind of this impending burnout, or I can't keep doing this. I was getting fatigued.
okay.
Like, I was tired of the whole pursuit of excellence, whatever that meant.
Mm,
As a as a um, as a staff team, we met together every Monday morning for a production meeting. And I cringe when I even say that
oh,
today. But like, we
right?
went through every dot and
Yeah.
tittle of the service,
Yeah.
and we graded
Yeah.
it as to whether it needed to be improved or whether it was good. And
Right.
I was beginning to realize that we couldn't produce this thing that we were after. We could never get excellent enough. Our newly remodeled worship center had, like, kind of whetted an appetite in the
Yeah.
congregation for something that we just couldn't deliver. And so I was
Yeah.
hearing responses like, well, the music's too loud and it's too soft. I was hearing
Right.
that the services were too polished or they weren't polished enough, that my messages were too biblical and not relative and relevant enough, or they were too relevant and not biblical enough. And I just like I was getting frustrated. And I think what was happening is I was noticing the tension inside of me between, and I couldn't articulate it, but I knew that there was something that God was doing inside of me, um, that was in tension with what I was being asked to do to lead the church. And the
Mm.
fact that those two are in tension should be
Hmm.
disturbing. It
Yeah.
is disturbing as I look back, but at the time, that wasn't the case. And the way that I started, go ahead, you have a question.
Oh, well, I was just going to say, as you're bringing up intention, um, so you've got on one hand, you've introduced us in with your story of this hardworking God. You know, that's the environment that you grew up in was very hardworking, but
Yeah,
it sounded also kind of modest and simple in terms of
yeah,
church structure and programming.
yeah,
And then you are leading this church. Where did you get that model from? Like
yeah. I think it.
you brought the hard working into it. I can see that, but where did the model come from? Was there a
Yeah.
particular church or organization that you were modeling your church after?
Well, I mean, yeah, at the time probably Willow Creek, but it also came out of the fact that the CRC that I grew up in was so insular, and I was
Yeah.
wanting to reach out to people, and there was
Okay.
a sense of you can't bring them in because they're not like us, and they wouldn't say that. They're very gracious and wonderful
Yeah.
people,
Yes.
but the
Yes.
experience of it was like if you're not Dutch, you didn't fit
Yeah.
into this culture, and so I was wanting to reach out, and my wife had a similar perspective. And
Hmm.
then that was when Willow Creek was
Yeah.
growing, and so that was part of the image as well. Is
Yeah.
is how do I become? That's kind of the model that was put out in front of us. We weren't
Yeah.
we weren't fully seeker sensitive, but we or seeker driven, but we certainly were oriented at the time in the seeker movement.
Yeah. I think
Yeah,
a lot of churches during that time, and maybe some still are, very influenced by that
yeah,
model, the
yeah,
megachurch model and the
yeah,
structure. You're a new senior pastor, new at managing this many people. What
yeah.
else do you do with them other than the
Right.
models that you've seen that are
Yeah,
out there?
yeah,
Um, but
yeah.
really cool that leadership coach started asking you these questions.
Yeah.
Where
And
did
what
those questions lead you eventually? Go
yeah,
ahead.
so what was interesting then is that all this is where that stream of God's faithfulness comes, because he kept
Mm,
putting people in and situations that would unravel or start to point us in a different direction. And I had hired a new discipleship kind of formation pastor, John Takama, and he had interned over at Willow, and it actually got kind of a sour taste in his mouth,
hmm.
and he was quite a bit further along than I was in being able to see how an attractional model actually got in the way of some of the interior work that
Hmm.
people needed to do. And he was a strong presence. I might even say he was a bit stubborn, which is what he needed to be to stand up
Wow.
against me. And so John was doing things that were right, like in
Yeah.
terms of the kingdom, in terms of internal work, in terms of formation, he was doing the right things. But what it was resulting in was less people coming to church, not more, which then fought with my own
Mm.
sense of I wanted to grow the church. I remember one time, early on, we had a fairly robust small group program, which was common back in the day.
Mhm.
And John was paying attention to the leaders, and he was hearing they were tired and wore out.
Hmm.
And so he said to him, if you want me to invest in you and walk you through a year of kind of just formation and tending to your own heart, you're welcome to set aside your small group, and I'll do that. And we thought maybe 20 or 30% of the leaders would do that. Well, 80% just like they were done.
Wow.
They were absolutely wore out. And
Wow.
so what happened is I mean, obviously it caused a ruckus, because it's not like they just walked away, but there were no people there to take their place, because we kind of created a consumer culture by this time. And so it caused a ruckus in our church, because when the small groups went away, I had people telling me, "You've taken my community away, you've taken my friends away," kind of things like that. And so again, I found that tension, that being torn between what God was uh, doing in me and what I was still trying to, like, thinking I needed to do externally in order to grow the church. And that tension just kept getting harder and harder, got more and more stretched, until, like, I was aware that I was at the edge of something, like a crisis was right around the corner.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. It is just so God to, I mean, I don't know how that guy got involved in your life after you modeled your church after the church that he had just left. But I
Yeah.
mean, how did you meet him? Was it
Well, so
totally just
that's
the
the
guy, or
thing.
did you seek him out? Like, oh, you saw his resume. You're like, Willow Creek, we need him here. Or how did
No,
that
no,
happen?
no. I think it was a conspiracy of Cheryl, my spiritual
Oh, okay.
leadership coach, who quite honestly was a spiritual director. Although
Wow.
she's a phenomenal leader, she's really more of a spiritual director and a
Yeah.
ministry coach. Well, she knew John and felt like John would be somebody who'd be perfect for the job, and so that's how he ended up coming here.
Okay, so subtext, she's like reading what's going on in your life, and she's like, "I have just the person for you."
Yeah, yeah,
if
exactly, exactly.
if my questions aren't resonating, maybe this guy will come in and help you really see them. And
Yeah, and he was much more able to, like I said, he was further along in understanding, like, how programming and so forth, they actually affected the formation process. Like, what a church was
wow.
doing affected how they were going to carry out their ministry.
Wow. You might be touching on this in your story moving forward, but particularly with John, and for you now as a seasoned pastor who's walked through this entire journey, there might be other pastors out there who are on that track of building their church, making it bigger, making it better, not really intentionally wanting to create a consumer culture,
Yeah.
but maybe they have people on staff who are resistant, would maybe have discernment and wisdom of where this could take them to a point of crisis. What would you say to younger Ken? Or what do you wish you would have known at that time, if it's even possible for us to like imagine what that would be
Yeah, I mean,
like?
I
But
think what I wish I could have done
what
is, I
would you
wish I
say?
could have been in a place where I was not quite so fearful, because I think it was the fear of what John would do that would decrease the growth of the church.
Hmm.
So I think it's to erase, if I could say anything, it is to let go of the idea that what God wants is a big church.
Hmm.
Like, you have,
That's
that's the thing you got to let go of, because it's the wrong focus. Um,
wow.
that's just, and when I could let go of that, that's where things uh, started to change, later on. But again, it had to ramp up into a pretty significant crisis.
So, what can you validate for maybe younger Ken or other leaders or pastors, knowing that when you say let go of the idea that God wants a bigger church, what are you acknowledging or validating that they're also letting go of that may be difficult for them to let go of the idea that God wants a bigger church?
Well, I mean, I think what they're having to let go of is a sense of that's where their identity is found. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
most of us to some degree are in ministry. None of us get into ministry with
Mm-hmm.
pure motives.
Yeah.
We're all trying to figure out our own selves and our own relationship with God, our own place in the world. And I
Mm-hmm.
think a lot of pastors find their identity in their church and in their ministry. It's something that they're good at in some way or
Mm-hmm.
another. And so they find affirmation. And
Mm-hmm.
so that becomes a bit of a drug. So it, and again, that desire is a legitimate desire. Like,
Right.
that's what, it's just, where do we find it? Like, at
And
some
how do
point,
we order it?
right, right. How do we reorder that desire to
Mm-hmm.
find it met, that significance met in God, as opposed to what I'm doing and building as far as a church? And yeah, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, like how that really
Yeah.
happened in me.
Yeah. Okay. Well, take us there. Tell us,
Yeah,
you've taken us right to this place, the precipice of the crisis.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And so in June of 2009, I was preaching pretty much like I had been preaching for the past 8 years. And like I'd said, there was this tension that was going on between what God was trying to do inside and what I felt was required to run the church. And I'm
Mm.
preaching, and right in the middle of the sermon, it was as audible as I almost have ever heard God. But somehow the Spirit spoke, and as I was preaching, I could hear the Spirit say, "What are you doing? What is this really all about? It's like this is just a bunch of smoke and mirrors." And it wasn't accusational. It wasn't
Right.
like, but it was clear, and it was deeply unsettling. But obviously, I mean, I finished the sermon and nobody was any the wiser. But by Tuesday at our staff meeting, I was coming undone, and so I just kind of just laid out whatever was in front of me, what I was feeling. I tried to put words around it the best that I could, that God was drawing me deeper into something internally. And I was struggling with what we were trying to do as a church. And I was questioning, did we do the right thing? Should have we built this or rebuilt this worship center? Like, did we get off track somewhere? So I was wrestling. Obviously, they're confused. Because I was confused. I didn't know how to put words around it. But
Was this at the production meeting, or was
yeah, well,
this
no, no, this
one-on-one?
wasn't. This was in the pastoral staff meeting. So
The
that was more a
pastors.
worship arts meeting. Then we had
Okay.
Tuesday, we had staff
Yes.
meeting. So Monday was our
Okay.
production meeting. Tuesday was the staff meeting. So
Okay.
it was at a staff meeting. And fortunately, again, John Takama, and then another staff member at the time, Matt Theodore, both of them could sense that like God was up to something, that God was doing something. So they called the elders to meet the next day. And this is where I just
Wow.
want to be really clear. Like, God was doing this in a bunch of areas in the church. Like, our
Mm.
elders were going through some crises in their own
Mm.
lives, that God was drawing them deeper. And
And
so,
then you have
so
80%, you said, of the life group leaders are
yeah,
starting to like
they're,
need something
mhm.
deeper.
Yeah, so they went through a kind of a formation process. So it's bubbling all over the place. And so they come, and they listen to my story. I think about it in retrospect. Like, so many people have heard horror stories between pastors and elder boards, and that just was not my
Ah,
experience. Like,
what a gift.
this group sat and they listened and they asked questions, and most of all, they didn't react, because if they
Wow.
would have reacted, I think it would have undone what God was
Mm.
trying to do.
Mhm.
It's interesting, like, during that season, there were a lot of people who, when they heard what was going on inside of me, they were like, "Well, why didn't your board fire you? Why didn't they fire you?" And they just were able. They sensed God was doing something, and so what they did is they gave me some time away. They said, I need you to, like, just take some space and try to discern what it is God's going to do." So I decided to go down to Anaheim, and the only reason for that was a few months later, Lance Pitlick, who was the senior pastor of the Anaheim Vineyard, where Wimber was at it years
Yeah.
before.
Yeah.
Um, he was up at our church, which is an odd story in and of itself. But he was up at our church, and he had just said, "If you ever need some space, like, we got all
Hmm.
kinds of space here. If you just need it, come on down sometime." And so I needed a space, and so I decided to head down there. Um, I I didn't know, like, I I didn't know why I was going necessarily. It took me about 3 months to unwind my schedule enough to get there. And
Wow.
during that time, so between like June and October when I left, like, God got really silent except for two things. I
Hmm.
again, and that's another thing that kind of marks my stories. These places where God, at least my understanding of God, there was He spoke just very clearly. And so in
Wow.
this season, I heard God, the Spirit, say just as clearly as could be. It was personal. The first one was an invitation to come away and die. Just every time I
Wow.
said, like, God, what are you asking? Come away and die. Come away and die. That was the personal invitation. And then the second one was really for the congregation, because I'm wondering, what
Mhm.
do I do with this church that's
Yeah.
growing?
Yeah. You want me to come away and die? what do I do with them?
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. And what I heard was God just say, "Well, bring them to me. Just bring
Oh,
them to me." And the reality is, I didn't really know how to do either one of those. Like
wow.
I knew how to bring somebody into a, like, pray a prayer, come to a, but I didn't know how to bring someone uh, um, to God. So
I have a
those were the
question
two
for
statements.
you.
Yeah. Hmm.
So, between the staff meeting and actually going on retreat, what does your wife think is going on?
Yeah.
And what are the conversations that are had? Because I'll tell you what, my conversations when I was in that place where you were at,
Yeah.
not that it's exactly the same, but I would come home and my husband would hear the unfiltered, like what did that look like? How did you unpack that with her?
Yeah. And so I would say that my wife was there before I was. Like
Wow. Okay.
she smelled some of the stuff.
Mm,
Um, she smelled some of the unhealth that was going on
mm,
underneath the surface. Um, I'm an 8 on the Enneagram,
mm-hmm.
so I'm not always, especially unformed. I was not able to see where I was leaving a wake of people in my, behind me, whereas she could
Wow.
see that a little bit more
Mm,
and was more concerned about that. So I think for her, it was like this relief, like, oh,
wow.
God is like, so I think she was, quietly, um, just prayerfully holding the process, because I think she knew what God was up to. Like, I think she knew something needed to happen in me.
I'm just curious because you said your wife didn't grow up Christian or in the church,
Yeah.
and you kind of grew up in this very stoic
Hmm.
model that was very well defined. And did that feed into her sense of like something's off here at all? That because she wasn't kind of like raised in this is how we do church. Well,
Yes.
this is the movement, the flow of things. It is up and to the right. It's grow, grow,
Yep.
grow. Like, and sometimes when we encounter people who weren't raised in church,
Yeah.
sometimes they're, for lack of a better word, BS meter
Yes.
is higher than
Yeah.
ours. Like
Yep.
we can delude ourselves into thinking sometimes we're doing something for God and He needs us to do this. But sometimes
Yeah.
these people in our life, I'm just curious, is that a part of her story at
Definitely.
all?
Definitely. She when she came to Christ, it was not a theology, it was a person. And she
Mm,
had a relationship with a person, with Jesus.
mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm.
so it didn't make sense, all the growth strategies and stuff like that. That just was not her wheelhouse. It wasn't. She's not a strategist. That's not how she thinks. She's very relational, and felt like the strategies and growth processes were they were overshadowing the deep relational part in our relationship with God.
Oh,
So
that's beautiful. That's
yeah,
beautiful.
yeah,
So, those are two really important things that you said that God spoke to you very clearly. Come away and die with me and bring this
yeah.
church
Bring
to
them to
me.
me. Yeah, yeah. Not exactly a church growth strategy. Uh,
No, not death and handing this
yeah,
whole thing over that you've been working for so many years.
yeah. So
And yeah,
yeah,
how did
so
you unpack that?
yeah, so I went in October of 2009. I headed down to Southern California, and that's there was really a like, God just was everywhere in the air at that space. It was just thick with God's, like, what God was working on. But I
Wow.
wasn't, obviously I wasn't sure what was going on. I didn't quite know why I was going. I went down south because I had a church to kind of hang out at, and Cheryl Fleischer, who's my spiritual director, lived in San Diego, so I figured I could make a trip down there, a
Oh,
couple. So I put my motorcycle in the back of my pickup, grabbed my Bible, a couple of recommended books, and headed down south. And it was just kind of out of sheer obedience, because I didn't really know what I was going to do. And it
yeah.
was a shaky obedience, because I got down halfway to McFarland, California, which is like, think, in the middle of nowhere, and then go another 50 miles. And I pulled over to get gas, and I just was like, "What in the world are you doing, Ken? This is stupid. This is
Hmm.
crazy. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps, go back and just get back to work." And as I'm filling up the pickup, reach over and grab the book that's next to me, and I have the quote here somewhere. A quote from Henri Nouwen jumped off the page, where he said, "Somehow I have to trust that God is at work in me, and the way I'm being moved to new inner and outer places is a part of a movement of which I'm only a small part." And
Wow.
something about that spoke to me so deeply, and it actually, those words held me for years. Like that, something that God is doing in me is just a small part of something else that he was doing. So I got back in my pickup, headed down to Anaheim, uh, pulled into a 2-star hotel with a kitchenette, kind of got the
Wow.
lay of the land, did some grocery shopping, and went to bed. And the next morning, I woke up without any sense of really what to do. And so I just continued reading scripture where I had been reading. I'd been working my way through, kind of a typical Bible reading plan. I was just working through it. And it just so happened to be, and again, here's God's faithfulness. I was in Luke 22, which is the story of Jesus at Gethsemane and his
Hmm.
prayer, of, Father, if this is your will, not mine, but yours be done. And I always saw that. I mean, I preached on that passage. I knew it well. I'd always seen it as, Jesus loves me enough to give his life for me, that he would be willing to do this. But when I read it through this time, in light of that invitation to come away and die, I was aware of the level of trust that Jesus must have had in the Father in order to be able to say those words. And God again just said, "Ken, I've asked you to come away and die. Um, do you trust me that way?" And I just said no. Like honestly, I
Mm.
don't. I There were some things I needed. The number one was control. And
Wow.
I was not going to let go of that. I didn't think I was going to be okay if I let go of that control. At the same time, I was aware that things weren't working out very well internally. Like
Hmm.
I was, if I kept on the track that I was on, my soul was going to die. So I found myself in this place of like kind of death by my hand or death by God's hand.
Wow.
And I knew the right answer theologically, but it didn't make it any easier. And so I just tried to distract. And it was wild because I would get on my motorcycle or I'd get on in my pickup to go to a movie, or I'd go to some recreation place or go to grab dinner. And I'd get to that, my kind of distraction of choice for the day. And I literally, Sarah, I couldn't get out of the car. Like it was like I was velcroed in, and I would turn around, grab something at the grocery store, go back to um, my hotel, and just continue that wrestling with God's question: "Do you trust me? Do you trust me?" He just held me in that tension. And, despite my objections and despite my resistance, my stubbornness, I never experienced God as harsh or demanding,
Mm.
which again, that fought against my perspective of God. Like I
Mm-hmm.
never experienced God. He would just simply, I never experienced him as harsh. He would just like ask the question and then turn me loose to wrestle, and I'd come back and say, "No, I don't trust you yet," and he just asked the question again.
Wow.
So despite
Which really speaks to the maybe the beginning of the undoing of the God image that you
Yeah,
had from a child, that God was kind of harsh and
yeah,
get pull yourself up by your bootstraps, be hardworking. So you're like eh, choosing to deliberately open yourself to a
yeah,
whole new God of your understanding.
yeah,
And I also find it really interesting that earlier in your story, you had mentioned you'd used the word drug
hmm,
as, like the production, the up and to the right, that
yeah,
momentum. Um, and I can certainly relate to that,
yeah,
as a leader, that adrenaline that comes with all of this momentum and the success and all of that. And I used to work at a monastery for a very brief amount of time, where we up at New Camaldoli Hermitage in Big
yeah,
Sur. and we would welcome retreatants, and they would really struggle those first several days with the silence and the solitude, the
Yeah.
emotions that would come up when they didn't have whatever their drug was in their
Yeah.
life. And I use that word not in a condemning way. I use it in a way that that's the way that we cope sometimes. That's the way that we've been taught to
Yeah.
live and to survive or to
Yeah.
earn.
Yeah.
And I just think it's so fascinating that you had Now in there in
Yeah.
the car with you, because he is just
Yeah.
the poster child of
Yes.
somebody who really embraces those emotions that
Yeah.
come up and
Hmm.
chooses to dive deeper. I love his work in the name of Jesus when he
Yeah.
talks about that as a model for
Yeah. For
Christian
leadership.
leaders.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I can see you doing that. I can see you moving,
Yeah.
into deeper and deeper places with God, but letting go. Maybe that was the death, maybe some of that, the death of the old God image. And
It, yeah, I mean, that was like it was this precipitating thing that happened where that, like, it was at that point where, like, it was God's, despite my understanding of God being kind of demanding growing up, it was like his kindness that won me over. It,
oh,
and
just
and
alluring you.
yeah, and I remember, um like, there was nothing dramatic in the surrender process.
Mm,
But I do remember, like, getting this sense that, oh, some things are going to get really clear now, like almost a foreboding sense. And I went to bed that night, with a sense of dread and a
mm,
sense of anticipation at the same
mhm.
time. But I remember for the first time in probably months sleeping well. I mean, I had
Wow,
just the deepest night of sleep. And so
that's
and
amazing.
so I wake up the next morning and I'm like, well, I don't know what to do. And so I opened my journal and I just literally wrote death list on the top. So I'm like, if you're going to tell me what I need to die to, what is it? And it was like fire hose fashion. God, just
Really?
as fast as I could write. And I went back to my journal and pulled them out. There were 10 things that God just said as fast as I could write them out. Um, so what did I
That's
need to,
that's
like,
the
what,
that's the actual journal that you wrote them in?
yeah, yeah. Well, I don't have it with me, but I copied them
Oh,
out
that's
here.
so cool that
So
that you have that.
yeah, yeah. So I went back, and the 10 things were just simply, I wanted to build my kingdom more than I wanted to build God's. I wanted the church to be successful so it would fill my need for significance. I wanted people to love me more than I wanted them to love God. I was living for Jesus rather than dying with him so that he could live through me. I was passively demanding that my wife fill the void in my heart. I needed to control situations so that they wouldn't threaten me or my competence. I was looking to possessions and hobbies to give life to me. I was taking responsibility for the outcomes of things that only God was responsible for. I was content with a band aid spirituality, um, dealing with the symptoms, but not ever curing the disease. And quite frankly, at the time, I couldn't have told you how to cure the disease. There was no way that I could have done that. And then, the last one was, I was prone to exaggeration in order to
Mm.
appear probably more acceptable or more important. And I mean, they came out at just like lightning speed. And I remember hearing, it was probably 20 minutes and I had them all written out. And I looked at them and I was like, oh gosh, there it is in black and white. But the list had come so fast that I didn't know how did this like manifest itself in my life. So I just turned the journal page and wrote one of those things on the heading and just started to kind of pay attention to what were the, like, precipitating events that happened because that part of me wouldn't die, or because I needed those things. And it felt like I kind of went into this probably 5, 6 day season of doing a 4 step on a 12 step recovery.
That is 10 as you, I mean, it was taking everything in me not to jump in because I'm thinking that's the fourth step
Yeah.
inventory. And then now you're in step 8 and you're
Yeah.
like looking at how your behavior has affected others. That could
Yeah.
only have been a God thing that you did all of that in
Yeah.
one 24-hour period.
Yeah. And so I just kept, and so it was, it was like this, it was a
Wow.
week that was really, I mean, I was calling people back home and
Wow.
asking for forgiveness, and most of them were like, I have no idea what you're talking about, but sure. And there
Are
were
you okay,
some,
Ken?
yeah, but there were some who definitely they were like, yeah,
Wow.
you did that, and yeah, you need to ask for, you need to ask for
Amazing.
forgiveness and stuff like that. Um, yeah, and so
Wow.
I got through all of that. And
I'm curious to know how you said that God was wooing you with kindness and set this whole stage with kindness. And um so maybe it didn't feel scary to take that fourth step inventory or to receive from God those 10 things that you needed to be delivered from.
yeah.
What Yeah, talk a little bit more about how that felt to be come into
Yeah,
that
so it
awareness.
was it was a it was a tension of, like, it felt, I mean, I would say it almost felt a little dangerous, and yet at
Mm-hmm.
the same time, uh, like, I knew that God could hold that. I mean, as we're talking, I go back to the statement from the Chronicles of Narnia. Is he safe? No, he's not safe,
Yeah.
but he's good. And
Good.
I had that sense of God, like, in the midst of this, God was good. And so by the time I got done with those, I don't know, 5 days or so, 6 days, of that fourth step work, I had this just massive pile of, this is all of the brokenness that
Wow.
is me, and it felt so heavy, and again, uncertain what to do with it. I just heard the Spirit say, like, read them to me again. Just read the
Really?
headings, read them. And so I opened the journal and I read the first one, and Sarah, um, was like God grabbed me by the face
Mm-hmm.
and, like, looked me right in the eye, and I'd say, I want to build my kingdom more than yours. And he looked at me and just said, Ken, I know. I've known this all the time, and I love you.
Mm-hmm.
And then the next one I would read it and he'd say, I know. I saw it. Um I knew it was there, and I love you. And I love you. And like, I threw my worst at God, and he didn't even flinch, like, it and
So you
in
did
that.
your fifth step with God,
Yeah,
face to
I
face.
guess so.
Like the fifth step is to share what it is, your character defects, like what has
Yep.
come to mind that are standing between you and your higher power or your
Yep.
pathway to
Yeah.
wholeness. And you did that face to face with God and
Yeah.
had this experience that so many other, 12 steppers talk about,
Yeah.
that they feel this unburdening. Did you feel this unburdening? Did you feel, what are the
Yeah. I
tears?
mean,
What
I
did
mean,
you, what were you feeling at the time?
at that point, like, I couldn't put words to it at the time, but I knew something deep in me was starting to change. Like, there was
Wow.
a freeing that was beginning to happen, and yeah, I knew things were going to be different.
Mm, mm.
Like, something had to be different. I didn't know how it was going to work itself out, but I did know that, like, I had discovered, like, I was the first one. I had rediscovered something that, has been known for generations, and that is the transforming power of God's love. Like, I had run into it, and I just went, that's what everybody needs.
As you
That
were
they're
sharing this, I can like feel how that transformed
Yeah,
you. I'm really curious to hear how when you left that retreat and you
yeah,
are seeing your elders, you're seeing your church body, you're seeing your wife, how did that transition happen? How did they see you and hear
yeah.
hear what you
So
experienced?
it's fascinating that we've been talking about a 12-step program. This
Yeah.
probably then goes to show that my wife was in many ways further along on this journey. But she said when I came home from my time away, she said it felt like somebody had come out of a rehab. Like she said, that's what it felt like. And I had like I something in me lost the drive for building the church in the way that I had been building it, and I wanted to do something different. Like, so what I found is my energy, those first, I mean, it was months. I would go into my office in the morning and sit in my chair, and it was like Jesus was sitting next to me, and I'd read through the Gospels and just be overwhelmed by God's love, just over and over and over again. So the image, that I have is like I was driving my car down the road, down the freeway, thinking I was doing just a great job, when this process made me look in the mirror and I realized I'd had a semi that had been pushing me down the road the entire
Mm.
time. And I went, well, wait a minute. I don't want this semi pushing me. So I pull over and it goes by, but now I have no idea how to drive. Like I got no motor. I got nothing to do that. But I did know that, like, I was really clear that everybody, or at least what I thought naively, everybody's going to want to know this love that I've experienced. That's what it's all about. It's just about God's love,
Yeah.
and not so much though. Like the
Wow.
reality was, um, it was such a shift from where we were as a church. I remember the first Vision Sunday that I had coming home. So it was a few months after I'd gotten back. And normally Vision Sundays meant we had a big hill to climb. It was either a
Oh,
building
I bet.
program or we had something we were going to do in the community and stuff like that. Not this time. I like bring two chairs up on the platform and just talk to them about what's been going on in my office for the last months as I'm sitting with Jesus, and I walk them through um, John 15 and the abiding passages, and that this is what we
Yes.
need to do is to learn how to abide in God's love. And half of the church loved it, and the other half of the church, like, not so much. They were deeply confused, and I
Mm.
understood why, because I surrounded myself with a lot of driven people. Like, that's what driven people do.
Yeah,
They
and you
surround
said that
themselves.
yeah, and you said that you had unintentionally created a consumer culture. So you're dealing with
Right,
consumers, and that's not all on you. We live in a consumer culture,
right,
of course. So now how do consumers respond when you are on stage with just yourself and Jesus?
right.
like
You you
like
you find you find another place to go. So I started
yeah.
getting, like, the people who, not the elders and staff and some of the core leaders, but some
Yeah.
of the more driven people who I just found a kinship with. It's like we were using the same drug. um,
Yep.
and so, like, they started to voice, both to me and to leadership and to other people, that I'd lost my ability to lead, that I
Mm,
was having a, like, kind of a midlife crisis, and that they needed to do something about that. And the more I leaned into the love of God, the more they didn't know what to do with me. But I couldn't, like, I had nothing else to talk about than that. Like, that was so front and center
oh
for me.
gosh.
And in retrospect, the whole process should have been slower. But I'd been building up in me for years,
Mm,
and they didn't have that opportunity for that buildup. And so what
mm,
felt like so clear to me they had not had the time to catch up to that. So,
mm,
but I also knew that, like, this, like, our staff had to change as well in this. So
mhm.
I was communicating this to the congregation, but even more so, like, I knew that our staff had to reorient the way we were thinking about ministry. And so, rather than the typical staff business meeting that we had every Tuesday, where we'd go through all of the things that we needed to do to grow and sustain the church, we started spiritual practices. And
Wow.
so we kind of ditched the business, and we would have somebody come in, whether it was a spiritual director. John Takma did them. I would do a couple, but we would just bring up a small kind of something to kind of uh, poke some interior world questions, and
Mm-hmm.
then we would send everybody out anywhere they wanted to go on campus for a half hour to journal and be
Mm-hmm.
with God,
Mm-hmm.
and then they'd come back, and we would either talk in small groups or in the big group um, together, and we talk about what God was doing in us. And there were a few staff at the beginning who were resistant, and even some ended up leaving the staff because of that. But for the most part, it just became this really, really sweet space. It was like the best part of the week. Staff, they'd miss other things, but they wouldn't miss the staff meeting. And eventually they started to do this with their lay leaders. So rather
Wow.
than just a meeting, they tended to the leader's heart as well. And so they do these practices. And within a couple of years, um, we had between 25 and 30 people coming to our staff meeting who were lay people and pastors from other churches, because they just wanted a space to bump into God and to process that with one another. And 15 years later, that's still how I run staff. We
Oh my
don't have
gosh.
a lot of business conversation in that meeting. It's mostly about tending to our own souls.
Wow. Well, I'll see you tomorrow then.
Yeah,
Tomorrow's Tuesday.
exactly.
I'll be there. Oh,
Yeah.
wow. That's such a beautiful, beautiful thing. So, the people who were really open and receptive to that on your staff, what do you think came alive in them that wasn't seen before or acknowledged as a need before? Just to give some voice to maybe for other pastors who may have staff walking with them who may need some
Yeah.
things to be seen.
I think they moved from being pawns that were
Mm,
needed to accomplish another purpose to
mm,
actually being people with whom God was interested in, and their stories and their values and everything about them mattered just as much as mine did and anybody else's did. So, we became a very flat structure.
wow.
It was something we
Okay.
all,
So the
started to just.
hierarchy, you mean?
Yeah, the hierarchy was gone very, very quickly
Wow.
in that process. Um,
Which the platform becomes the
yeah,
table.
yeah, no, that's yeah, very, very, very true, very true. And so
Oh, wow.
they just kind of they leaned into it, and then they were able to start to see and hear what was going on in the congregation. And so as the staff was encountering Jesus way. And I want to be real clear here. Like, there were people in the congregation who had, long before I had been there, had this sweet, intimate relationship with Jesus. It's not
Oh, for
like,
sure.
yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, like, they were
Yeah.
already there. They just,
They're holding the place up.
yeah, exactly. They were
Unbeknownst to
praying.
you,
They were
they're the
probably
ones
praying for me. They've
yeah.
probably been praying for me from the day I became senior
Yeah.
pastor, going, God, would you change this guy?
Yeah.
Um,
Aw.
so like, it's not like this was new, but
Right.
it was not what our focus was. But what we began to see was that, like, in order for us to move the congregation in the direction of formation, they had these defeater beliefs. So
Hmm.
these kind of ideas and thoughts and practices that actually got in the way of of formation, of becoming more like Christ.
Hmm.
So, things like an angry God. So you can't, like, how it was like me. How do you bring your brokenness to God if you think that he's going to be angry? So you hide instead of
Wow.
open up. So this
Yeah.
idea of an angry God, this idea that salvation is a point in time rather than an ongoing
Mm.
reality, that escapist mentality that Willard talked about so much, that, like,
Yeah.
it's about getting to heaven, not about what God wants to do with us on earth. And,
Which is
we,
probably why I have it listed here somewhere. You're one of the formational pathways you offer in your church is the journey,
yes.
because
Yep.
it's not necessarily, it's a journey that happens over time.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And yeah, absolutely. So we kind of saw this, and so we decided to, like, we were going to address this. And again, we're building an airplane in the air kind of a thing, because there weren't many churches who are in that, at least that I knew of. There's probably churches out there all over who are deeply
No,
formational,
Ken.
but
I
I
mean,
didn't
what you've
I
done is
didn't
fascinating.
I didn't know, and so we ended up, just John Takma and I, we'd put together this conversational sermon series called Expanding Definitions. And in 6 weeks, we literally like just tore apart the core doctrines of the church. And it was
Wow.
so disruptive. I mean, we talked about
Wow.
salvation and the gospel and sin and the nature of God and what discipleship was and what the church was. And it really caused a deep ruckus. In retrospect, we should have done this over like a year or 2 years. But again, what we found is that some people were just like eating it up. The people that God was already working in, they were just eating this up, going, "Yes, that's what I've been." You're putting words. I heard so many times you're putting words to the things that I was feeling inside of me. And then
Oh.
the other half, so they were kind of like, "Oh, he's gone off into heretic land." Like I was going in a direction of, I was coloring outside of the church theological boundary. So now
Mm-hmm.
people were leaving because I'd lost my leadership, and they were leaving because I had lost my theological moorings. So by
Mm-hmm.
2015, the church had grown or shrunk to half its size.
Oh
Um,
my gosh.
and it was interesting. Giving never decreased during that season,
Wow.
but the church shrunk, and it
So there's
was
a thread of God's faithfulness that
again, yep,
he's faithful through the seasons, that
yeah.
financially you guys are going to make it through.
Yeah.
But
And that
yeah.
that was a God knew that was a big fear of mine. And so I think
Mm,
he was like, "You got enough to tend with. I'll take care of this one so that you're
yeah.
not," it was really a grace that that was the case. But it was also, I mean, that was part of what my sabbatical where I met you, why I was on that, was really to do some grieving over those
Mm,
years. Because even though, yeah, those were some of the most just painful years. I felt regularly misunderstood. I
mm-hmm.
felt like everywhere I went, I mean, Turlock's not a huge community, and every time I go into a store or somewhere, I'd meet somebody who used to go to Monte Vista Chapel.
Mm,
There were pastors in town who were talking about, like, it had gotten to me about what Ken was doing over there to foul up such a good, ministry that was going on.
mm.
There was even a season somewhere during that season. I had somebody had started a Fire Ken Facebook page, um,
Oh gosh, how
and
painful.
so like it just like what felt so life giving to me felt so death giving to others, and it just
Mm,
was such an odd, like it was so hard. So we just strapped in, like we
mm,
kind of strapped in the elders, the key lay leaders, the staff. We were clear we were not going back to an attractional model, and we knew that it was the love of God that would change people, but we knew that it was slow. Um,
yeah.
we weren't going to use. We committed, like, we're not going to use shame and disappointment and guilt to motivate people. We got to
Mm-hmm.
trust God. We're gonna bump them into
Mm-hmm.
Jesus. That became our phrase. We'll bump them into Jesus, and then let God do the change work. So it just was a
And
it was
and
a it was a hard season.
he turned some tables. He had some woe
Yeah,
to you, and he
yeah,
had, some quick pushes, big changes that were pretty disruptive,
yeah,
and yeah, I think we can look back at our story and see where maybe things were a little rough around the edges, but
yeah.
also a whole lot of Jesus there too,
Yeah,
and
and the reality is,
sometimes
I don't look back with like a sense of, oh, I have regret,
yeah. Yeah,
because the reality is I was where I was doing what I could do, and the only way I could
that's
get where
so
I am was
good.
to be where I was. Like that's
Right.
just the reality. We can't. That's another thing. Like I would encourage people is you can't uh, disdain your story, because it's the
That's so good.
beautiful thing that God is working in to make you into who you are. So you just gotta trust that. But those were rough years.
You mentioned John 15, the pruning passages, and did you find that to be some sort of anchor for you as things became difficult? I don't know if you've read um, Henry Cloud's book, Necessary Endings, where
Yeah.
he talks
Hmm.
a lot about the pruning and how it can be
Yeah.
painful and disruptive. And maybe that
Yeah,
spoke to you, or anything else that spoke to you during that season or was an anchor for you?
yeah, good question. So yes, returning to the love of God, like finding my home in the love of the Trinity, was just that deep
Mm.
returning space. But in order to do that, like I continue to meet with a spiritual director, and she was a lifeline that would continually reorient where I was at. I mean, I would be thinking like I'm doing the worst thing in the world, and she'd be like, just, you're exactly where God needs you to be. Just, she was such a help in that space. The elders and the staff and the core lay people who saw the vision and were living into it. I remember one guy came into my office one time, and I was discouraged. And he said, "You know what, Ken? God always works through the remnant. Aren't you glad to be a part of the remnant?" Like, I'm just so glad to be. Like, it was just a turn the tables over.
Yeah.
So that
Yeah.
that was, having some core people around me. I built a cedar strip canoe during that season.
Did
Six
you?
600 man hours, with
Oh
with
my
with two
gosh.
friends and my son. And it was, I needed something. I'm a
Yeah.
builder,
Yeah.
and everything around me was unbuilding, was falling apart, and
Wow.
I just needed to see something get put together. And so
Yeah.
every night I would go out to a friend's house, and he let me use his shop. And for months, we built this beautiful cedar strip canoe. So that was another way to cope. I needed voices that
Yeah.
were similar to mine, and that's what led me actually to the doctoral program at Portland Seminary. I went
Hmm.
and enrolled in the Doctor of Ministry and Leadership and Spiritual Formation, and that's
Okay.
actually the program that I co-lead with
Yeah.
Mary Kate Morse now. And I'll just give a shout out to that. Like, if
Yeah.
you want to try to figure out how to do leadership and formation in your context, there is not a better doctoral program to go through. So I'll just say that. Um, and then
Portland
I think the other
Seminary.
thing was trying at Portland Seminary. Yeah. And
Hmm.
then the other thing was to tend, like, because like I had this energy yet to do something, but I didn't want to put it to work building things that I needed to build. So I was trying
Mm.
to, like, find places to work where God was working and to tend that. And so we built an internship program that would help people learn kind of what the staff had been learning for the last 5 or 6 years, 8 years together. Um, and then that changed. So you talked about the journey earlier. That's what actually led to the journey, because one of the mothers of one of the people who were going through the internship program,
Hmm.
she was reading the materials and the exercises we were doing, and she was, drawn in by them and encouraged by them. And one Sunday, she met me after church, and she's actually an elder now, but she met me after church and said, "So, Ken, when are you going to do this stuff in a way that it's available for those of us who have real jobs?" In other
Yeah.
words, that couldn't get away at 10 o'clock on Tuesday morning.
Yeah.
And she was
Yeah.
so right. And that's what led to the journey.
Hmm.
We built, along with Cheryl Fleischer, we built this year-long process
Yeah.
of the slow work of God over this long period of time. And in the last, we've done 5 cohorts, I think 4 or 5 cohorts, and a little over 200 adults have gone through it, and it shapes the flavor of the church.
So that's quite different than so tell me how discipleship, spiritual formation probably wasn't even a term that you were
Yeah,
using at that time. But like,
yeah.
tell me how spiritual formation discipleship looked in the old Ken way or the
Hmm.
consumer driven church. Um, and now, like, what unpack that journey model for us a little bit. Um,
Yeah, and so I think the journey is a part of the story.
mhm.
I would say a great, like, if somebody wants to know more about it,
Yeah.
Hagberg's Critical Journey is
Yeah.
an important read, because it
Okay.
talks about kind of the stages of faith. And I would
Yeah.
say that my initial way of thinking about discipleship was about getting people to accept Christ, to
Mm.
know some content, and then to get busy serving. So it
Yep.
was more externally oriented.
Yeah.
And now I'm more aware of tending to the rest of the journey, which is that dark night of the soul, the
Mm.
death to self. and then the living for God as opposed to living for my own sake. So
Mm-hmm.
I think it's different that way. Um, yeah. So we've gotten really clear as a church about what we're about in this season.
Mm-hmm.
Um, like you, let me just before I, yeah, we have to do those first parts.
Yeah.
So that was something that I actually just wrote an article about this because for such a long time, we ended up working so much on the formation side that we weren't doing those first parts. And so new
Mm-hmm.
believers didn't have a place to really plug in um,
Mm-hmm.
because we were doing this deep dive on the other side. But now we've come back around and we have a more holistic kind of perspective. And so,
Yeah.
kind of what it looks like now is we're real clear about our vision. It's Christ in us, Christ through us.
Mm-hmm.
So, Christ has got to do the work in us so that Christ that can do the work through us. We're real clear about spiritual formation as well. Ruth Haley Barton actually is like, she's very particular about definitions, and I understand why now because
Hmm.
clarity is helpful. So we
Mm-hmm.
use Jeffrey Greenman's definition of spiritual formation, which is our ongoing response to God's grace, shaping us into the image of Jesus Christ through the work of the Holy Spirit in the community of believers for the sake of the world. And then we add for the glory of God. So that's what we mean when we talk about spiritual formation. Because if you go online and you look at spiritual formation, it'll scare people. So
Yeah.
we had to get really clear about what spiritual formation is. And then we have a like this formation conversation that we talk about a lot. And we use the phrase OIC, which is
Mm-hmm.
kind of like OIC. But it's
Oh.
also OIC. So it
Yeah.
begins with observation because we believe that your life is the exact school God has enrolled you in to form you into the person He wants you to be.
That's so
So
good.
you need to pay attention to your life. You need to
Yeah.
start observing. It's not just about learning stories out here. It's about paying attention to your own life. And then you
Yeah.
got to listen for God's invitation because there's a lot of places you can grow, but we don't know where that is. But God knows where and when. And so we need to listen to that. Where is God inviting us? And then the third thing, C, cooperation, is how do we learn to cooperate with God? How do we
Yeah.
figure out how to cooperate? And
It's
then
very
lastly,
Ignatian.
pardon?
It's very Ignatian.
Yeah, very much so.
Like noticing and
Yep.
seeing, and then I hear the balance between action and contemplation in there where you go out and you participate with God. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And then lastly, we just have kind of this um like our paths for discipleship. Um like we realize that there's multiple paths that need to happen and they don't work in a linear way. But we've kind of said we need to know God's story. So you've kind of
Mm-hmm.
already referred
Yeah.
to that. We need to develop Christ's character and we need to advance God's kingdom. And so we
Mm-hmm.
do some things in all of those that stir that up a bit.
Yeah.
But it's nothing flashy. Like if you would come to Monte Vista, you would, or you watch us online, it would look like most churches do: music, prayer, sermon, the Lord's Supper, those kind of things. Um, but I think it's what's underneath that's different. I
Yeah.
think I said this to you when we were at coffee, but Dallas Willard said something that I just hold on to, um, where he was asked the question, like, what would a formational church look like if it actually showed up? Like, how would it be different from another church? And as only Willard could say, he went, well, I imagine it would be the same, but different. And and you're like, thanks, Yoda. Um,
Yeah.
but that was exactly the truth because
Yeah.
it's not the programs. Like you can have small
No.
groups and all kinds of stuff.
Yeah.
It's what's underneath it. And so I would say that Monte Vista, we're the same, but it feels different internally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And for you personally, maybe that's where the story work or the story groups came from. And
Yeah.
you talked about you had some grief going on, and those 10 things that you had on your list were huge things to unpack. And
Yeah.
then the sermon series that you did with those
Hmm.
undoing of these attributes of
Yeah.
God, that it was kind of a God of our misunderstanding.
Yeah.
Um, as you're unpacking all of this stuff and connecting the dots with where maybe they had their roots in your life or maybe particular circumstances or relationships, um, was it story work and the contemplative practices? And what did that unpacking process look like for you? And how did you process that grief or
Yeah.
letting go of things and embracing something new? How did that process, the dark night of the soul, yeah,
Yeah.
is what you also referenced.
Yeah. And so I think part of it having a guide, part of it having somebody who could feel the things that I wasn't able to feel. I remember
Mm,
with all, John Takama was one, Cheryl Fleischer, some other people in the
mm-hmm,
congregation as well, where I would tell a story of like the hurt, and
mm-hmm.
they would hear it, and I would just be stoic. Like I'd just be telling it, and they were just in tears as they were hearing it.
Yeah,
And something about that drew the grief. It was like a drawing salve that
yeah.
allowed me to feel the emotions and actually
Mm,
engage them as opposed to shove them down, which was kind of my way, in growing up. So having people hear the story was
mm-hmm,
a significant part of grieving, hearing and seeing and not correcting or not trying
mm-hmm.
to tell me what I did was right or wrong. Just holding the story with me and with God was huge.
Yeah. Um, well, that makes sense with your upbringing, with the stoicism that
Yeah,
you talked about, and
yeah,
maybe the surroundings that you had. You never had anyone mirror or model
yeah.
what emotions looked like. Like,
No,
this is the appropriate emotion that is
yeah,
okay for this, inviting that into that experience. So you kind of are like reparented by these
yeah.
friends that were in your life,
Yeah, and it's an ongoing process. Like my
for
my
sure.
wife, my wife will still, like, I'm
Yeah.
like I have a it's still a struggle for me to it's that vulnerability
Mhm,
that
mhm,
those emotions bring up, and I
mhm.
was raised not to be vulnerable. My wife says you were raised to survive a war, not live at peace.
Wow.
And I think there's a lot of truth to that. And again, my parents were wonderful people, but
Yes,
they were oriented towards, like, you got to make life work.
to survive.
Yeah,
Yeah, especially as immigrants,
yeah,
like all of our or many of our parents
yeah,
were.
yeah.
So that is an interesting question, and I don't want to take us on a rabbit trail, maybe, but maybe you can speak to, we're on this journey, we're growing, we're changing, especially on the heels of something that is such a massive change.
Hmm.
How do you not fall back into the up and to the right in terms of growing deeper and becoming more like Jesus? Like, how do you live and embody a sense of awareness in you on the daily, that there are parts of my personality that are probably just are, and
Yep.
there are parts of my spirituality that I'm just not going to get. I'm never going to be perfect.
Right.
How do I accept myself for who I am today, um knowing and seeing all that I've been awakened to?
Yeah, I think it goes back to that, returning to the love of the Trinity, because
Mhm.
self acceptance is secondary to God
Mhm.
acceptance. And so
Mhm.
as I find God accepting me in my broken places, and
Mhm.
looking at my story and saying, Ken, I know that, and I still love you. That's what gives me the permission to be able to do that. So I think it's this returning to the love of the Trinity, and that's something that that's what we encourage our congregation when we go through the journey. Their one thing of homework for the entire year is to spend 5 minutes imagining themselves in the midst of the Trinity, and just letting the
Wow.
Trinity just just to love on them. We give them a picture of that on our first gathering, and we just want them to return to that love. And over time, God softens the heart when we return there.
Yeah, and bringing us back to that place of awareness that I am child,
Yep.
you are God,
Yeah.
you are
And
Father.
then when you kind of swim in those waters, the
Mhm.
growth, like the church, like the unhealthy growth aspect, it
Mhm.
you can tell that it's broken. because it doesn't
Mm,
feel like the love of God. So it's like the old counterfeit thing. Like you stay with the
mm-hmm,
real long enough, you start to be able
mm-hmm.
to smell the counterfeit. And
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
I think that's what happens as you stay with the love of God, the counterfeit just becomes more evident. So
Yeah.
so yeah, but there are still, I mean, there are times I'm drawn towards like wanting to grow the church. There'd be benefits to some of that,
Mm-hmm.
and yet you have to. And there's nothing wrong with church growth. Like a
Mm-hmm.
growing church is a healthy church. I don't, and
Mm-hmm.
a big church, that's fine too. There's nothing wrong with that.
Mm-hmm.
But doing it for the sake of itself is what's so broken. And so we return
Right.
back to like what's drawing me. That's another big shift. Is we talk about the shift from being drawn or from driven to drawn. So
Wow.
so like this idea of I'm driven by something as opposed to drawn to God, and we feel that when it's God at work, he draws us rather
Yeah.
than drives us. And you can, it's subtle difference.
Yeah. I immediately thought of the picture that you shared of the semi
Yeah.
pushing.
Yes.
And then now we see Jesus as,
Yep. Mhm.
leading us out
Yeah.
front. Oh,
Yeah.
that's beautiful. That's a
Yeah.
beautiful.
Yeah.
So, just another question. For the spiritual practices like you mentioned that you've implemented into your church and into
Mhm.
your own life, how do you feel we do you feel that there's any way to implement these spiritual practices, this deeper relationship with God, going beyond that third stage of growth? Is there a way to do all of that and embody all of that as leaders and as a church without paying some sort of cost
Mm.
or I don't know.
Yes.
Like, I think it can become trendy. The spiritual
Yeah.
practices, like, it
Yeah.
can become a trendy thing to talk about or maybe play around with. But is there a way to do that without letting go, like you said, or surrendering, like you said, some things? Where is there a way to avoid the cost?
Well, I don't think that we will ever avoid the cost individually. Like, I think that
Mm-hmm.
God will lead all of us through some dark night. It may
Right.
be
Yes.
deeper for some than others, but it's going to be, I think that's a reality. I think institutionally, the shift comes in how we do early discipleship,
Mm-hmm.
and that we don't. I think what the tendency of the church in early discipleship. So who God is, what His nature is, and we build things in concrete. And
Mm-hmm.
I think we build certainty. And I think what we need to do in those early stages is help build curiosity rather than just certainty. And if
Yeah.
we're curious rather than certain, when God begins to act in ways that aren't in line with who we thought He was,
Mm-hmm.
we're a little bit more malleable. Like
Mm.
the deconstruction isn't quite so, it doesn't need a wrecking ball. It needs the potter and the clay molding,
Oh, that's
as
good.
opposed to like a sledgehammer to knock through the concrete. So I think that's a big part of it, is how do we do the first part of discipleship in a less dogmatic, certain way,
Hmm.
um, so that the deconstruction process is normal, and that we normalize it and we talk about it to people. Because I think that's the other thing, is most people who've grown up in the church who go through that wall, they feel like
Mm-hmm.
they're the only ones.
They're the only
Like
ones.
I must be crazy, and so they end up leaving the church because they don't feel like they fit. So if we normalize it and have a group of people who go through that together, which is kind of
Hmm.
what the journey helps do,
Yeah.
that that makes a big difference. So can we avoid the dark night? No, but I think institutionally it doesn't have to be quite so violent.
Wow. So by creating safe spaces like the
Yep.
journey,
Yep.
modeling that like as you do from the
Yep.
platform, um, deepening that with your leaders and your staff.
Yep.
This is a part of our language. Like we know
Yep.
that at some
Yep.
point,
Yep.
each of us
Absolutely.
individually are going to walk through this and we're here. We're here
Yep.
to do
Yep.
this
Absolutely.
together. That's
Absolutely.
beautiful. That's really beautiful. Well, So we talked about what the to the table, your spiritual and emotional reformation, your
Yeah.
reconnection with a new God of your understanding, reconnection with the staff of your church and your congregation in a new and beautiful way. Um, as you are, did you want to comment any more on that season of your life, or?
No, I think we've kind of covered at
Okay,
least enough
okay.
enough of
Okay.
it.
I mean, I could ask 1,000,001 questions because
Yeah.
I just find it so fascinating and encouraging. But as you're contemplating your story as a whole, looking back, and you've mentioned several times, like, oh, I wish I could have done this differently. I could have done that differently. Just imagining yourself back at those places of maybe leading up to the crisis, around that crisis point where you took that turn on that retreat, what would you say to a pastor or a leader who is sensing that tension that you
Mhm.
mentioned? What would you say to them, or maybe to the younger version of yourself?
Yeah, I think a little bit about what we talked about earlier, to release this idea that a bigger church is the goal that God has for you. Like that's
Mm,
not necessarily the case. A healthy church is what God is looking for. It's God's responsibility to build the church, not you.
mm,
And so to release that and to allow yourself again to return to home at the Trinity, in the Trinity, like to
mm.
just continue to find where God's love is, and where you're meeting God in God's love. Yeah, yeah, I
That's
think
awesome.
that's the, and which is why, so for me, when people yeah, there's two things here. Like, I do think that there is an institutional process to go through. Like
Hmm.
I'm actually writing and working through that.
Yeah.
I do think there is an institutional process that you can help people through, but personally, I think it's where it's got to start. And
Hmm.
so I think that, personally, the pastor needs to find their home in the love of the Trinity, let go of that future idea of a big church, and then find somebody who's ahead of you. Like,
Yeah.
don't be afraid of people who are more mature than you. Like, so many leaders are threatened by that. Be surrounded by them. Between Cheryl Fleischer and Mary Kate Morris, John Takama, some of our elders, there are so many people who have been before me, who I've just been able to learn from, and they've reoriented my way of seeing things. Because, like Willard talks about, it's an upside down way of living. Like,
Mm,
it's like I'm flying a plane this way and I think it's right side up. In reality, it's not. And you need someone to help coach you through that.
yeah.
So I think to have somebody there
Hmm.
to help us with that is a big deal.
What I think is so beautiful is that the people that you chose to be a part of your life at that time, and maybe that was totally a God thing, but I do think it's beautiful that it ended up that way, that you chose people who were embodying the person that you wanted to
Yeah.
become. They
Yeah.
weren't just people who were echoing back to you the person
Yeah.
that you were then, or this consumer driven church,
Yeah.
the performer mindset. You had somehow, somewhere in you, chose people who were different, have a
Yeah.
different voice to call you into something new.
Yeah. And
And
that's part of my temperament. Like, my biggest fear is that I would, like, walk off a cliff and I'd turn around and somebody'd say, well, I could have told you that, and I'm like, don't, like, say it before I
yeah,
walk off the
yeah,
cliff, because
yeah.
I'm profoundly aware that I will do that.
Well, that's the Enneagram 8 in you. You're ready to hear the other side.
Yeah,
The other side of
yeah,
the coin. You're always
yeah,
ready to see what's on the other side. That's
yeah,
awesome.
yeah,
So, you talked a lot about the spiritual practices. You mentioned a couple different resources. Is there any specific resource that you would want to mention as a recommendation to somebody maybe at that particular point in their journey where you started working with a leadership coach, or
yeah. I
at
mean,
any point?
yeah, I think, again, I'll plug the doctoral program, because
Mm-hmm.
I think if you have a degree that allow you into that, it's such a formative process
Mm-hmm.
over 3 years. That's one resource. I
Mm-hmm.
realize that's not attainable by everyone.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's, again, like, I do some coaching. I'm not trying to promote that, but like if I'm open to conversations and phone calls to have some interaction with people who are trying to wrestle through this. I know that was so encouraging to me. I met Kent Carlson, who had kind of done this up at a church in Sacramento, and he wrote a book called The Renovation of the Church. So if you want to read
Huh.
that, there's a story. It's by Kent Carlson, and it kind of it feels like our story, only it's in their version, their form.
Wow.
Um, so getting people around you that are helpful. And then I go back to that, I feel like a broken record. I was reading Eugene Peterson's biography, and
Oh, the
one,
pastor?
the one that was written about him, A Fire in
Oh,
My
about
Bones.
him. Oh,
Yeah.
yes, yes.
Yeah, the recent one. And what was interesting is somewhere in it, he said that every pastor finally comes across their one sermon and they just preach that one sermon again and again. And I
Oh,
feel that my one sermon is God's love for you. Like God just deeply
yeah.
loves you. And so I go back to pretty consistently um, David Benner's Surrender to Love, Henri
Mm,
Nouwen's Life of the Beloved, Brennan Manning's Abba's Child,
mm-hmm.
um, Ronald Rolheiser's Holy Longing, Dallas
That's on
Willard,
my nightstand right now.
Dallas Willard's Divine Conspiracy, because he helps you
Mm,
see things upside down the way we need to.
mm,
And, hang out there. I think if you
mm.
hang out in those places, we don't need more material. We need the material we have to go deeper.
Yeah,
If I could simply live out what Nowen talks about in Life of the Beloved, I'd be done.
I know, right?
That'd
Yeah,
be the end of the game. So
yeah,
I think it's returning to those core practices and processes that bring you back to the love of God.
yeah. That's awesome. Great resources, really great resources.
Yeah.
Oh, Ken, our time with you has been so rich, so encouraging, just so validating, even of our own
Mm.
story. Oh, I would love to hear how you want to close us out. I know that you've brought something along with you today to share with us.
Yeah, it kind of starts at, it's about that beginning, about that faithful presence. And it's a quote from Bonhoeffer, and it's up on my wall in my office, and I
Mm,
go back to it again and again. So I think I just want to end with that. Bonhoeffer said this, or he wrote this. He said, "It's not we who build. Christ builds the church. Whoever is mindful to build the church is surely well on the way to destroying it, for he will build a temple to idols without wishing or knowing it. We must confess he builds. We must proclaim he builds. We must pray to him, and he will build. We do not know his plan. We cannot see whether he is building or pulling it down. It may be that the times which by human standards are the times of collapse are for him the great times of construction. It may be that the times which from a human point are great times for the church are times when it's pulled down. It is a
mm.
great comfort which Jesus gives to his church. You confess, preach, bear witness to me, and I alone will build where it pleases me. Do not meddle in what is not your providence. Do what is given you, do it well, and you will have done enough."
Wow. I need to read that again. That is incredible. That is incredible. Thank you for that. It reminds me of the scripture, the trust in the Lord, build the
Yep,
house, but those that labor,
yep,
those will labor in vain who try to
yep,
build it themselves.
yeah,
That's
absolutely.
beautiful. That's
So it's
beautiful.
it's it's God who does this work, and we've got to get beyond ourselves and trust that He knows a lot more than we do about it.
Yeah, he knows a lot more than we do. And part of that is he knows that it's too much for us
Yep,
to do on our own. And
yep,
that's where the love and the kindness comes
yep,
in
yeah,
and just reminds me of you and that retreat with Jesus holding your face. I
yeah,
know. And this has been too much for you. I just feel the weight coming off of you.
yeah,
Oh, so beautiful. Ken, your story is beautiful. At some point, I know that I'll get to meet your wife this weekend. At some point, I would love to have her come on the podcast and share her side of the story
yes,
and just to give us a whole other female wife
yep,
perspective and as she's been co-laboring and ministering alongside of you through all of this. So
Yeah, that'd be
put a
great.
little bug in her ear for me.
I'll do that.
Well, thank you, Ken.
Yeah,
I will link all of the ways that people can connect with you, whether through coaching or the Doctor of Ministry program. And I look forward to seeing you on Friday. And thanks for being here.
absolutely. Thanks so much. Great to spend time with you.
Thank you for joining us today on Platform to Table. You can find us on Instagram and platformtotable.com. If you're a Christian leader, I'd like to invite you to join us on Monday nights at a Platform to Table Anonymous meeting. PTA is a 12-step spiritual reformation group for Christian leaders struggling with compulsive performing or other codependent behaviors on their platform of leadership. We also have a storytelling monastic retreat, a contemplative writing pilgrimage, and a national park hiking pilgrimage coming next spring. For more information on how to sign up, visit our website. Next week, Dr. Kelly Goddard will be joining us to share her story of spiritual reformation. Kelly is the founder and CEO of Deep Well Leaders, a nonprofit organization that provides high-performing leaders in the Middle East and North Africa with training and resources that foster spiritual maturity and sustainable leadership. Subscribe and sign up for our newsletter to be the first to know when it goes live.